August 1943, Camp Concordia, Kansas. The sun hung heavy over the flat horizon, baking the earth into cracked submission. 50 German prisoners of war marched in rigid lines toward the mess area, their boots kicking up dust that clung to sweat-soaked uniforms. They were men hardened by battle, tempered by propaganda, their eyes sharp with suspicion. The Americans, they'd been told, were uncultured brutes, men who lived like animals, who lacked the refinement of the fatherland. At the long wooden tables, they sat, shoulders squared, waiting for the trick they were certain was coming. Then the farmers arrived, carrying trays of something absurd, ears of corn, charred from a grill, glistening with butter, set down before them like some kind of joke. Wolfgang Klein, a wiry infantryman with a scar across his knuckles, stared at the offering. Corn, in Germany, it was for pigs, for cattle, for creatures that rooted in the dirt. A low chuckle spread through the group, sharp and mocking. "They feed us like beasts," one prisoner muttered, loud enough for the others to hear. Just as the Führer said, the laughter grew, jagged with defiance, until a farmer named Amos Reed, his face lined with years of sun and loss, picked up an ear of corn, took a slow, deliberate bite, and fixed his gaze on Wolfgang. "This ain't pig food," he said, his voice low but firm. "This is what grows from free soil." One by one, the prisoners hesitated, then tasted it. Their laughter faltered, replaced by something else, shock, then a flicker of doubt. The corn was sweet, warm, unlike anything they'd been taught to expect from this so-called backward nation. In that moment, a single bite began to unravel years of lies. If you want more hidden stories that history tried to sweep under the rug, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to know how far these truths are reaching. 3 weeks earlier, Wolfgang had arrived at Camp Concordia, his wrists still raw from the cuffs that had bound him during the long journey from North Africa. He was 24, a panzer grenadier who'd survived the deserts of Tobruk, only to be captured in a chaotic retreat. The camp was a sprawl of barracks and barbed wire, surrounded by fields that stretched endless under a sky too big for comfort. The prisoners were processed with efficiency that felt almost German, names recorded, uniforms swapped for denim coveralls, rules explained in halting translations. Keep your head down, work when told, don't cause trouble. Wolfgang memorized the routine quickly. Wake at 5 a.m., roll call, breakfast of thin oatmeal or bread, then out to the fields. The Kansas farmers needed hands. Their sons were gone, fighting in Europe, in the Pacific, or dead, and the crops wouldn't wait. So the Germans were put to work, harvesting wheat, tending sugar beets, and strangest of all, pulling weeds from rows of corn that grew taller than a man. Wolfgang worked alongside men like Ernst Becker, a quiet medic from Munich who'd seen too many bodies to believe in glory anymore, and Klaus Vogel, a 19-year-old conscript who still spoke of the Reich's inevitable victory, with the fervor of a boy raised on Goebbels' promises. The work was grueling, the sun relentless, but the Americans surprised them. The guards, mostly young men unfit for combat or too old for the draft, didn't scream or swing rifle butts. They handed out water during breaks, sometimes with a nod that felt almost human. The farmers were sterner, their faces carved with distrust, but they demonstrated tasks clearly: how to thin a row, how to check irrigation lines, and then stepped back. No beatings, no barked orders, just an expectation of effort. Wolfgang noticed the way they moved. These Americans, their hands rough as any German farmers, their backs bent from the same endless labor. It didn't fit the stories he'd been fed, the ones about a nation of weaklings who'd collapse under the Reich's superior will. "They're not what we were told," Ernst said one evening, wiping dirt from his hands after a day in the fields. They were sitting outside the barracks, the air cooling as the sun dipped low. Klaus, picking at a blister on his palm, snorted. "They're soft," he said, "using us to do their work while their men hide in factories or die overseas." Wolfgang didn't respond, but his eyes drifted to a farmer across the field, a man named Amos Reed, who'd been watching them all day. Amos was broad-shouldered, his hair graying at the temples, his movements deliberate as he repaired a fence. There was nothing soft about the way he swung a hammer, nothing weak in the way he carried a bucket of tools like it weighed nothing. Wolfgang looked away, unsettled. Ernst caught it, said nothing, just lit a cigarette he'd traded a day's labor for. That was Ernst's way, watching, waiting, letting you wrestle with your own doubts. By the 4th week, a rhythm had settled in. The prisoners worked in crews of 12, each assigned to a different farm. Wolfgang's crew included Ernst, Klaus, and a former U-boat sailor named Dieter Braun, whose sharp tongue and sharper temper made him the group's unofficial enforcer. Dieter spent evenings reminding them of their duty, of the fatherland waiting for their return. "Don't get comfortable," he'd hiss, his eyes darting to anyone who laughed too easily with a guard or accepted a second helping of food. "They're the enemy. They'll turn on us the second they don't need our hands." Wolfgang nodded, his jaw tight, because agreement was easier than admitting the questions piling up in his head. The Americans didn't act like enemies. They worked alongside the prisoners, shared water from the same jugs, even taught them a game called baseball during lunch breaks, laughing when Klaus swung the bat like an axe and missed the ball entirely. Then came the announcement that shifted everything. Private Jimmy Sato, the camp's translator, a Japanese-American whose family was locked in an internment camp somewhere in California, stood at roll call one evening, his voice steady but his eyes uneasy. "Starting tomorrow, Crew 5 will rotate to Amos Reed's farm. 2 weeks, wheat and corn harvest." Wolfgang's crew was 5, so were Ernst, Klaus, and Dieter. The other prisoners exchanged glances, sensing something unspoken. A guard, not quite quiet enough, muttered to another, "Amos lost his boy in Tunisia. This'll be a hell of a time." Wolfgang felt a knot form in his chest. Tunisia, where he'd fought, where he'd been captured. The coincidence was too sharp, too raw. A father who'd lost a son to their war, now forced to watch German soldiers work his land. This was where the civility would break, where the rules of the Geneva Convention would bend under the weight of personal grief. The next day, as they loaded into trucks for the ride to Amos's farm, Dietrich leaned close to Wolfgang, his voice low. "Watch yourself. This one's got a reason to hate us. He'll be looking for an excuse." Wolfgang nodded, his hands gripping the edge of the truck bench. He'd seen what grief could do, how it could turn a man into something sharp and unpredictable. In Germany, he'd watched neighbors turn on neighbors after bombing raids, their pain spilling into rage. He expected no less from Amos Reed. But when they arrived, Amos was waiting at the gate, his face unreadable, his eyes scanning the prisoners like a general assessing troops. He didn't speak, just pointed to the fields and handed them tools. The work began without fanfare. Wheat to be cut, corn to be checked, irrigation lines to be cleared. Amos worked alongside them, his movements precise, his silence heavy. Wolfgang kept his head down, but he couldn't shake the feeling that every swing of his scythe was being judged, every step measured by a man who saw his son's killer in every German face. That evening, something unexpected happened. As the prisoners finished their work and prepared to return to camp, Amos's wife, Clara, appeared at the edge of the field. She was small, her hair pulled back in a practical bun, her apron dusted with flour. She carried a basket, and from it she pulled tin cups and a jug of water. Not the warm, metallic stuff from the camp pumps, but cold, clear water that tasted of a spring Wolfgang hadn't known since childhood. She handed them out, her movements brisk but not unkind, and said something in English that Jimmy translated. She says, "Drink, you've earned it." The prisoners hesitated, suspicion etched into their faces. Dietrich's eyes narrowed, but Ernst took a cup, drank deeply, and passed it to Wolfgang. The water was cold, clean, and for a moment Wolfgang forgot where he was. Clara watched them, her expression unreadable, then turned back to the farmhouse without another word. The gesture lingered in Wolfgang's mind that night, nagging at him as he lay in his bunk. Water wasn't a weapon, wasn't a trap, but it wasn't nothing either. It was deliberate, a choice, and he didn't know what to make of it. Beside him, Klaus whispered, "Maybe they're not all bad." Dietrich's voice cut through the darkness like a blade. "Don't be a fool. They're playing you. They want you soft, grateful, so you forget who you are." Wolfgang said nothing, but his fingers traced the scar on his knuckles, a reminder of a bayonet fight in the desert, of a life where trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. Still, the water had tasted good, and that fact alone felt like a betrayal of everything he'd been taught. The next week brought more surprises. Clara began appearing at midday, bringing bread she'd baked that morning, dense and studded with seeds, nothing like the sawdust rations of the war. She didn't smile, didn't speak, but she set the bread on a crate and let Jimmy explain that it was for everyone. Guards, farmers, prisoners. Wolfgang watched Amos during these moments, waiting for a sign of resentment, but the man only nodded at his wife, his face a mask of exhaustion, and something else, pride maybe, or resignation. The prisoners ate, some reluctantly, some with a hunger that overrode their pride. Klaus tore into the bread like a child, his face lighting up with each bite. Ernst ate slowly, savoring it, his eyes distant. Dietrich took a piece, chewed once, and spat it into the dirt. "Charity," he sneered. "They think they can buy us." Wolfgang ate, but each bite was a battle. The bread was good, better than anything he'd had since before the war. But it came with questions he didn't want to answer. Why would a woman whose husband had lost a son to their war feed them? Why would Amos allow it? The propaganda had been clear. Americans were greedy, selfish, incapable of sacrifice. Yet here was Clara, her hands worn from work, giving them food she'd made herself. Here was Amos, grieving, silent, but never raising a hand against them. Wolfgang's certainty, the ironclad belief in the Reich's truths, was starting to crack, and he hated how it felt like falling, like losing something he'd never get back. On the 10th day, the prisoners were told to expect a community event, something the translator struggled to explain. "A barbecue," Jimmy said, his voice halting as he searched for the German equivalent. A gathering, food, music, everyone together. The barracks buzzed with disbelief. A party? With prisoners? Dietrich laughed, a harsh bark that carried across the room. "A trap," he said. "They want to parade us, show off their captured Germans like trophies." Ernst tilted his head, considering. "Or it's just what they do. Like the Geneva rules, but more." Wolfgang didn't know what to believe, but he felt the weight of every eye in the barracks turning to him. He wasn't the oldest, wasn't the loudest, but his quiet intensity had made him a touchstone for the others. The one who reminded them to stay sharp, to stay German. "We'll go," Wolfgang said finally, his voice steady. "We'll eat their food, sit at their tables, but we don't forget. Not who we are, not what this war is." It sounded right, sounded strong, but as he said it, he felt the crack in his certainty widen. Because the truth was, he didn't know what to expect from Amos Reed, from Clara, from this strange country where enemies were given bread and water and invited to sit under cottonwood trees. He didn't know if this barbecue would be a humiliation, a trick, or something worse, something that might force him to question everything he'd ever believed. The sun was low, painting the Kansas sky in streaks of orange and gold, when Crew 5 marched to Amos Reed's farm. Wolfgang led the line, his back straight, his face blank. Whatever was waiting, mockery, violence, or some American game he couldn't predict, he would face it with the dignity of a soldier. The farm came into view, and Wolfgang's breath caught. Long tables stretched across the yard, shaded by trees that swayed gently in the evening breeze. American families were already there, farmers he recognized from the fields, their wives and children carrying dishes, laughing, moving with an ease that felt foreign. A fire crackled in a pit, the smell of smoke and meat heavy in the air, and someone was playing a guitar, a slow twanging melody that tugged at something in Wolfgang's chest. Clara greeted them, her apron swapped for a clean dress, her smile small but genuine. "Sit," she said through Jimmy's translation, gesturing to a table at the edge of the gathering. The prisoners sat, their movements stiff, their eyes scanning the crowd. Dietrich muttered under his breath, "They're watching us, waiting for us to grovel." Wolfgang didn't respond, but he felt the tension in his shoulders, the weight of being observed. The Americans sat at their own tables, some stealing glances at the Germans, others pretending they weren't there. The gap between the tables felt like no man's land, charged with unspoken history. Then the food arrived. Farm wives moved through the crowd, their arms laden with platters, fried chicken, golden and crisp, bowls of beans swimming in molasses, biscuits that steamed when split open, and then carried by Amos himself, a tray of corn, grilled until the kernels were flecked with char, butter pooling in golden streams. He set it down in front of the prisoners, his eyes meeting Wolfgang's for a moment before he turned away. Wolfgang stared at the corn, his stomach twisting. In Germany, this was animal feed, something you'd toss to pigs or scatter for chickens. Klaus leaned forward, confused, and Dietrich let out a sharp laugh. "Poor farmer food," he said, his voice carrying across the yard. "They're mocking us, feeding us like livestock, just like we were told." The laughter spread among the prisoners, a mix of nerves and defiance. It was proof, wasn't it? Proof that the Americans were as crude as the Reich had claimed, that their hospitality was a lie, a humiliation dressed up as kindness. Wolfgang felt the laughter bubble in his own throat, a release of the tension he'd carried for weeks. But then he saw Amos turn back, his face unreadable, his hands clenched at his sides. The yard went quiet, even the children pausing their games. Amos walked to the prisoner's table, slow and deliberate, and picked up an ear of corn. He held it for a moment, his knuckles white, then took a bite, butter dripping onto his shirt. He chewed, his eyes locked on Wolfgang's, and when he spoke, his voice was rough but steady. "My boy grew this," he said. "Planted it before he left for your war. Died in Tunisia, fighting men like you." He paused, the weight of his words settling like dust. "This ain't poor farmer food. This is what free men grow, what free men eat." He set the corn down, the sound sharp in the silence, and walked away. Wolfgang couldn't move. The laughter died in his throat, replaced by something heavy, something that tasted like shame. Beside him, Ernst reached for an ear of corn, took a tentative bite, then another. His face shifted, surprise, then something softer, something Wolfgang didn't want to name. Klaus followed, then another prisoner, and another. The corn was sweet, warm, bursting with a flavor that didn't belong in a world of war and lies. Wolfgang's hand stayed in his lap, his jaw tight. He wouldn't eat, couldn't cross that line, but the sight of his comrades, men he'd fought beside, men who'd sworn the same oaths, eating the enemy's food with something like wonder made his chest ache. Across the yard, Amos stood with Clara, his arm around her shoulders, his face turned away from the prisoners. Wolfgang saw the tremor in his hands, the way Clara leaned into him, and understood with a clarity that cut like a knife. This wasn't a trick. This was a man who'd lost his son to their war, serving his son's favorite food to his enemies, because his wife believed in something bigger than hate, and Wolfgang had laughed at it. The realization was a wound, deeper than any he'd carried from the battlefield. The corn changed something in Wolfgang, though he fought against naming it. It wasn't just the taste, though that lingered, sweet, earthy, nothing like the pig slop he'd been taught to expect. It was the act of it, the offering, the way Amos Reed had stood there, grief etched into every line of his face, and still placed that tray in front of men he had every reason to hate. Wolfgang worked the fields the next day in silence, his hands moving through the wheat with mechanical precision, but his mind was elsewhere, replaying that moment, the weight of Amos's words, "This is what free men eat." The other prisoners felt it too, though they didn't speak of it. Klaus ate his meals with less hesitation now, his boyish enthusiasm returning in bursts, as if the corn had unlocked something in him. Ernst was quieter, his eyes always watching, but there was a new softness in the way he handled the tools, the way he nodded at the farmers. Dietrich, though, grew sharper, his voice a low growl during evening roll call. "You're forgetting," he'd say, his gaze cutting to Wolfgang. "You're letting them make you weak." Wolfgang didn't argue, but he didn't agree either. The crack in his certainty was growing, and he could feel it spreading like frost across glass. The work on Amos's farm continued, relentless under the Kansas sun. The wheat was nearly harvested, the corn ripening fast, its stalks towering over the prisoners as they moved through the rows. Amos was always there, working alongside them, his presence a constant weight. He didn't speak much, but his actions were a language of their own. He'd point out a missed weed with a quick gesture, nod when a row was done well, or hand Wolfgang a canteen of water without meeting his eyes. These small moments piled up, each one a pebble on the scale, tipping Wolfgang toward a truth he wasn't ready to face. The Americans weren't monsters. They weren't soft either. They were men like his father had been, like his brother Friedrich still was, somewhere back in Germany, fighting a war Wolfgang was starting to doubt. One afternoon, as the crew cleared an irrigation ditch, Klaus started humming a German folk song, one Wolfgang's mother used to sing when he was a boy. The sound was faint, almost lost under the scrape of shovels, but it caught the attention of one of the guards, a lanky man named Roy, who taught them baseball. Roy tilted his head, listening, then started humming along, his version clumsy but recognizable. Klaus stopped, startled, and Roy grinned, switching to a twanging American tune about a lonesome cowboy. Klaus laughed, a sound so unguarded it made Wolfgang's chest tighten. For a moment, the ditch wasn't a prison work detail, but a shared task. The kind of work men did together in a world not torn apart by war. Amos, working a few rows away, paused, his hands still on his shovel, watching the exchange. His face didn't change, but Wolfgang caught the flicker in his eyes, something that wasn't anger or grief, but recognition maybe, or memory. That evening, Clara brought out more bread, this time with a small jar of honey, the kind of luxury Wolfgang hadn't seen since before the war. She set it on the crate, same as always, and Jimmy translated her words, "For strength." Dietrich scoffed, loud enough to draw eyes, but he took a piece of bread anyway, smearing it with honey before stalking off. Wolfgang watched him go, then took his own piece, the honey sweet and floral, sticking to his fingers. He ate slowly, savoring it, and when he looked up, he saw Clara watching him, her eyes kind but searching. He wanted to thank her, but the words wouldn't come. Not in German, not in the halting English he'd picked up. Instead, he nodded, hoping it was enough. She nodded back, then turned to Amos, who was watching from the edge of the field, his hands stuffed in his pockets, his face unreadable. The barbecue had been a turning point, but it was the smaller moments that started to reshape the crew. Klaus began picking up English phrases, mimicking Roy's drawl until the guards laughed. Ernst taught one of the farmers, a man named Karl, how to play skat, the German card game, using a deck made from scraps of paper. The farmer was terrible at it, but he kept coming back, his laughter booming across the barracks during lunch breaks. Even Dietrich softened, though he'd never admit it. He stopped spitting out the food, started eating with the others, though his eyes still burned with suspicion. Wolfgang noticed everything, his mind a battlefield of loyalty and doubt. He wanted to hold on to the truths he'd been taught, the Reich's destiny, the enemy's weakness, but they were slipping through his fingers like sand. Every ear of corn, every shared canteen, every moment of unexpected kindness was a hammer strike against the propaganda he'd carried like a shield. Then came the day that broke something open. It was late August, the heat so thick it felt like breathing mud. The crew was working the cornfields, pulling weeds from between the stalks, the air humming with cicadas. Klaus was at the end of the row, his shirt soaked through. When he swayed, his shovel slipping from his hands. Wolfgang thought he'd tripped, started to call out, but then Klaus crumpled, his body hitting the dirt with a dull thud. The world slowed, sounds muffled as Wolfgang ran, shouting for Ernst. The medic was there in seconds, kneeling beside Klaus, checking his pulse, his skin gray and clammy. "Heat stroke," Ernst said, his voice sharp with urgency. "We need shade, water, now." Wolfgang lifted Klaus's shoulders, Ernst grabbing his legs, and they moved toward the nearest tree, its branches offering thin relief from the sun. Amos was there before they could call for him, his face tight with focus. He dropped to his knees beside Klaus, his hands moving with a gentleness that didn't match his size. "Get ice," he barked to Roy, who was already running for the farmhouse. Clara appeared moments later, her arms full of wet cloths, a bucket of ice from the cellar. Amos pressed the cloths to Klaus's neck and wrists, his movements sure, like he'd done this before. "Stay with us, kid," he said, his voice low but steady. "You're not going anywhere." Klaus's eyes fluttered, his breathing shallow, but he responded to the tone, his fingers twitching as if reaching for something. Wolfgang stood back, his heart pounding, watching this man, this father who'd lost his son to their war, work to save a German boy he didn't know. The camp medic arrived, taking over with brisk efficiency, but Amos didn't leave. He stayed, his hands hovering, ready to help, until Klaus's color started to return, his breathing steadying. Only then did Amos stand, wiping his hands on his pants, his face a mask of exhaustion and something deeper, relief maybe, or resolve. Wolfgang couldn't look at him. The shame was too heavy, the realization that Amos had called Klaus kid, the same way he might have spoken to his own son. Ernst met Wolfgang's eyes, his expression saying what words couldn't. "This is real. This is who they are." Dietrich, standing at the edge of the group, said nothing, but his hands were unclenched, his usual scowl replaced by something unreadable. That night, Wolfgang couldn't sleep. He lay in his bunk, the barracks quiet, except for Klaus's soft snoring from the infirmary cot across the room. The boy was recovering, weak but alive, thanks to Amos. Wolfgang's mind kept circling back to that moment in the field, to Amos's hands on Klaus, to the way he'd acted without hesitation. Wolfgang had seen men die in the desert, had watched comrades bleed out while he could do nothing but keep fighting. He'd been taught that mercy was weakness, that the enemy was always the enemy, but Amos Reed had just saved one of their own, and Wolfgang didn't know how to fit that into the world he'd believed in. Ernst's voice came from the darkness, low and steady. "You're thinking too hard, Wolfgang." Wolfgang didn't respond at first, his fingers tracing the scar on his knuckles. Finally he spoke, his voice rough. "They lied to us, didn't they? About them, about everything." Ernst was quiet for a long moment, then said, "Eat the corn, Wolfgang. It's just food, but yeah, they lied." The words hit like a grenade, quiet but devastating. If the Americans weren't the barbarians they'd been told, if they could show mercy to men who'd fought against them, then what else was a lie? The Reich's promises, the war's purpose, the idea that they were fighting for something noble, It all started to crumble, and Wolfgang felt like he was falling into a void. The next morning, Klaus was back in the barracks, pale but grinning, recounting the story of his collapse like it was an adventure. Amos carried me like I was a sack of flour, he said, his voice full of wonder. Told me to stay with him like he cared. Dietrich snorted, but there was no venom in it, just habit. Wolfgang listened, his chest tight, and when breakfast came, a tray of biscuits and yes, grilled corn, he took an ear without hesitation. He bit into it, the sweetness flooding his mouth, and for the first time, he didn't feel shame. It was just corn, just food, but it was also something more, a bridge, a truth he couldn't ignore. The final days on Amos's farm passed in a blur of work and quiet revelations. The prisoners and farmers found a rhythm, not friendship, but something close, a mutual respect born of shared labor. Roy taught Klaus how to throw a curveball, laughing when the boy nearly hit himself in the face. Ernst fixed a broken pump with an ingenuity that earned a grudging well done from Carl, the farmer who'd lost its scat. Clara brought pies now, apple and peach, their crusts golden and flaking, and the prisoners ate without suspicion, some even thanking her in halting English. Wolfgang worked beside Amos most days, their silence comfortable, their movements synchronized. Once when Wolfgang handed Amos a tool he'd dropped, their fingers brushed, and Amos nodded, his eyes meeting Wolfgang's for a fraction of a second. It was enough. Then came the news that shattered the fragile peace. It was a Wednesday, the air cooler now, the first hint of autumn in the breeze. Wolfgang was in the cornfield, checking stalks for ripeness, when Jimmy appeared, his face carefully neutral. Wolfgang Klein, report to the camp office. The walk back was a haze, Wolfgang's mind racing, a reassignment maybe, or news from home. He wasn't prepared for the Red Cross official waiting with a thin envelope, his expression somber. Friedrich, Wolfgang's younger brother, dead in a bombing raid on Dresden. 18 years old, a boy who'd worshipped Wolfgang, who'd written letters full of pride and faith in the Reich's victory, now gone, crushed under American bombs. Wolfgang stood there, the words sinking in like poison. The official's condolences were a distant hum, Jimmy's translation unnecessary. Wolfgang's English was good enough now, but protocol demanded it. When he returned to the barracks, the rage came, hot and blinding. Friedrich, his baby brother, who'd wanted to be a pilot, who'd believed every lie they'd been fed, dead because of men like Amos, like Roy, like the farmers who'd fed them and taught them baseball. Wolfgang couldn't breathe, couldn't think. He wanted to scream, to break something, to make someone feel the pain tearing through him. That evening he found Amos near the barn, stacking tools for the night. The words came before Wolfgang could stop them, his English broken but sharp. Your bombs killed my brother. Your planes, your war. You feed us, act kind, but you murder our families. Amos froze, his hands tightening on a shovel. His face went pale, then flushed, his eyes burning with something Wolfgang recognized. Grief, raw and unhealed. My boy died in your war, Amos said, his voice shaking. Shot by men wearing your uniform. Don't talk to me about murder. They stood there, two men broken by loss, the air between them thick with everything they couldn't say. Wolfgang turned and walked away, his hands shaking, his rage a live thing clawing at his chest. For 2 days, Wolfgang stayed in his bunk, refusing food, refusing roll call. Ernst brought him water, forcing it past his cracked lips. Klaus tried to talk, his voice soft with worry, but Wolfgang turned to the wall, clutching a photograph of Friedrich, his brother's smile frozen at 16, before the war had taken everything. Dietrich watched from across the barracks, his silence louder than his usual rants. Even he seemed to understand that some pain was too heavy for words. On the third evening, Ernst returned from the fields with a tray. On it, a single ear of corn, still warm, butter glistening. Wolfgang stared at it, his throat tight. Why, he asked, his voice raw. Ernst set the tray down, his eyes steady. Because you're still here. Because hating them won't bring Friedrich back, just like hating us won't bring Amos's son back. Wolfgang wanted to throw the corn, to scream that it was all a lie, that kindness was a trap, that the war had taken too much for anything to matter. But he was so tired, so worn down by the weight of his anger. He didn't eat the corn, but he didn't push it away either. It sat there, a quiet challenge, a reminder of something he wasn't ready to accept. That night, Amos couldn't sleep. He'd tried, lying beside Clara, staring at the ceiling while her breathing steadied, but Wolfgang's words kept echoing, each one a blade. Your bombs killed my brother. Amos knew the math of war. knew that bombs didn't choose their targets, that grief didn't care who started it. But knowing didn't ease the ache. At midnight, he gave up, pulled on his boots, and drove to the camp. He didn't know why, didn't have a plan, just knew he couldn't stay still. The camp was dark, save for a light in Wolfgang's barracks. Amos stood at the fence, his son's dog tags heavy in his pocket, a weight he carried everywhere. He thought of Daniel, his boy, who'd loved planting corn, who'd laughed under this same Kansas sky, who'd died in a desert Amos would never see. On impulse, Amos drove home, returned with a small package wrapped in cloth. He left it at the gate with a note, his handwriting unsteady on a scrap of paper. In the morning, the guard brought it to Wolfgang, his expression confused but dutiful. Wolfgang unwrapped it slowly, his hands trembling. Inside was a small jar of peach preserves, Clara's handwriting on the label. Daniel's favorite. The note was short, each word heavy. My son's name was Daniel. He was 20. I hate this war, but I don't hate you. This is all I've got left. Wolfgang read it, then read it again, his vision blurring. The tears came, not soft but wrenching, pulling from a place he'd locked away since the war began. He cried for Friedrich, for Daniel, for every life the war had chewed up and spit out, for himself, for the boy he'd been before the lies had taken root. Ernst found him like that, the jar in his hands, the note crumpled beside him. He didn't speak, just sat there, his presence steady. When Wolfgang could finally talk, his voice was a whisper. He lost his son to us, and he doesn't hate me. Ernst nodded, his eyes soft. That's what they've been showing us, Wolfgang. That's what strength looks like when you choose it over hate. Wolfgang looked at the jar, at the note, at the proof that Amos Reed had driven through the night to give his enemies something sacred. And he understood, finally, that this wasn't weakness. This was courage, raw and real, the kind that could plant corn in a war-torn world and call it food for free men. The last days at Amos's farm were quiet, but the air had changed. The prisoners worked with a new purpose, not just to survive, but to finish something they'd started together. Klaus taught Roy a German drinking song, both of them laughing when the words got mangled. Ernst and Karl played scat again, the farmer finally winning a round and crowing about it like he'd conquered Berlin. Dietrich ate the corn now, no longer spitting it out, though he'd never admit he liked it. Wolfgang worked beside Amos, their silence a conversation in itself. When the harvest was done, Clara brought a final pie peach. Like the preserves, and the prisoners ate it slowly, savoring every bite. On their last day, Amos handed Wolfgang a small sack of corn kernels, his eyes steady. Plant these, he said through Jimmy's translation. Wherever you end up, they'll grow. Wolfgang took the sack, his throat tight, and nodded. It wasn't just corn. It was a promise, a piece of Daniel's field, a piece of Amos's heart. That night, back in the barracks, Wolfgang held the sack, feeling the weight of it, the weight of everything he'd learned. The war wasn't over, and the pain wasn't gone. But for the first time, peace didn't feel like a lie. It felt like corn growing tall, like a hand on a shoulder, like a jar of preserves left at a gate in the dead of night.